For centuries, the Americas acted as a massive 10,000-mile wall. If a merchant vessel wanted to move goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they had no direct path. They were forced to sail thousands of miles out of the way, navigating the dangerous waters around Cape Horn at the very bottom of South America. The French tried to punch through the Panamanian jungle in the 1880s to build a shortcut. They brought private capital and sheer willpower to the project, but malaria, yellow fever, and bankruptcy eventually wiped them out. Conquering this geography required the resources of a global superpower. Washington wanted to finish the job. By cutting transit times in half, the United States could project naval and commercial power seamlessly between two oceans. There was just one hurdle. The ideal strip of land belonged to the sovereign nation of Colombia, and the Colombian Senate outright rejected the American terms. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt responded by sending U.S. warships to the coast. Washington actively backed a Panamanian separatist movement, effectively blocking Colombian forces from putting down the rebellion. Panama declared independence, and the U.S. formally recognized the new republic almost immediately. Days later, the two nations signed the Hay-Buno-Varilla Treaty. It granted the United States exclusive, permanent sovereign control over a 10-mile-wide strip of Panamanian territory to build, manage, and defend the canal. The canal was more than a construction project. It was an act of map-making. By facilitating the secession of Panama, the United States secured a sovereign foothold in the center of the Americas, a 10-mile-wide strip of land it would govern as its own territory for the next 96 years. Over the next decade, American engineers excavated mountains and dammed rivers. By pouring millions of cubic yards of concrete, they built a system of massive locks to lift giant ocean freighters over the continental divide. For decades, the Panama Canal Zone operated essentially as a U.S. state. It functioned as the central artery for American military deployments and global trade, heavily guarded and completely under Washington's jurisdiction. But by the 1970s, holding sovereign territory inside another country became a diplomatic liability. Anti-American protests in Panama grew, and the international community began pressuring the U.S. to relinquish its perpetual claim. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed a set of treaties that established a definitive clock. The U.S. agreed to a peaceful, complete handover of the canal and the surrounding zone to Panama by the end of 1999. Washington committed to surrendering physical ownership on paper. However, keeping the canal secure and the region stable remained an absolute requirement for American defense. The decades leading up to that deadline tested Washington's patience. Central America became highly volatile, and the stability the U.S. required around the canal began to fracture. The sharpest threat of all came from Panama's own military dictator, Manuel Noriega. Once on the CIA payroll, Noriega turned to large-scale drug trafficking and violent political suppression, creating a highly unpredictable environment right next to America's most valuable strategic asset. In December of 1989, President George H.W. Bush launched Operation Just Cause. Over 24,000 American troops invaded Panama, dismantling the local defense forces to capture the sitting head of state and bring him to the U.S. to face drug charges. This action fit directly into a long history of American military interventions across Latin America. From Guatemala to the Dominican Republic, when an administration deemed a regional leader a threat to broader strategic interests, sovereignty was quickly bypassed. Operation Just Cause made the boundary lines perfectly clear. The U.S. was willing to prepare the canal for a diplomatic handoff, but it would still deploy overwhelming military force to guarantee the territory around it remained compliant. On December 31, 1999, the United States fulfilled its treaty obligations. The American flag came down, and the Panamanian government assumed absolute control of the canal's operations and revenues. Removing the American military and administrative presence created an immediate opening. One of the world's most critical maritime choke points suddenly lacked a hovering superpower. China stepped directly into that space. Rather than deploying troops or gunboats, Beijing arrived with a strategy centered on trade, infrastructure, and economic development. Chinese state-owned enterprises began pouring billions into the country. They secured contracts to build bridges over the canal, upgrade transit facilities, and manage deep-water ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, gaining immense leverage over global supply chains. The economic gravity produced diplomatic results. In 2017, the Panamanian government formally severed its long-standing ties with Taiwan and officially recognized Beijing, a move quickly mirrored by several neighboring countries. Where Washington historically relied on the threat of force, regime change, and direct territorial control to maintain its influence, Beijing is using transactional investments and port agreements to anchor its presence. The Panama Canal stands as an active test of a multipolar world. The hard military power that originally built the waterway is now forced to compete directly with the quiet economic